Aloha and good evening, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Jürgen Steinmetz, joining you from the Breaking News Show in Honolulu, Hawaii. With me is my good friend and old friend. We're both old, I mean, but
young friend.
Professor Geoffrey Lipman. He's in Brussels. He's with SunX, and he will tell us a little bit more what he's doing and what we're celebrating, because we're going to have only one Earth, World Environmental Day, officially on June 5th, but I think the celebrations start today. Today is June 3rd on Friday, and Geoffrey's getting all ready for some major events, and he is really the man when it comes to tourism and environment. He will tell you a little bit more about it. My background I choose, you don't see the Breaking News show. This is actually the North Shore of Oahu, our beautiful island where I'm located at. And actually, this was the place I lived for 25 years on the North Shore, and I kind of miss the view and the sound of the ocean and the birds and all of this. But let's go to Geoffrey. Geoffrey, hello, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. It's good to see you as always, and thank you for having me on your show.
No, you're always welcome, and we had you here many times. So tell us, what is the World Environmental Day?
Well, it's a day which was started actually 50 years ago when they had the first Environment Conference Summit in Stockholm. And the reason why it's so important to me is because, as you know, I'm running this organization, SunX, the Strong Universal Network, which is a not-for-profit foundation which has been set up with the support of Maurice Strong, the man who actually organized that first summit. So it's a very important day to memorialize for me. And also because, as I think I've said on your programs before, it wasn't just the first summit that Maurice Strong organized. It was also, he organized the second Earth Summit 20 years later in Rio. He was the first executive director of UNEP, the UN Environment Program. He took that and made it the first organization to go to Africa. He was just an incredible human being who, if you analyze it, did more to create today's sustainable development and climate response system than anybody else on the planet. You know, this is a guy who left school at 16, didn't finish his formal education, and he was a founding member of the board of the World Economic Forum. He was a founding member of the Brundtland Commission, which defines sustainable development. He was a founding participant in the Club of Rome and its 1972 story on planetary boundaries. And when he died in 2015, about 3 days before the Paris Environment Summit, the climate summit. And that summit started with a eulogy to Maurice Strong for his contribution, which was, you know, just incredible. And things he did, which I've discovered as I've been running this organization, I had no idea of. The man didn't finish high school, but when he died, he had 60 honorary doctorates, 60,
Wow.
60. And this is a guy who in 1992 at the Earth Summit, the Rio Summit, he had a table made, a single table for himself as the Secretary General, and 124 heads of state sitting around. You can only do this in Brazil. You can only get a table built that big. But I mean, just put yourself in that position, Thomas. I look back and I've done a few things in my lifetime, a few things I want to talk about as well on the show. But can you imagine sitting with 124 heads of state and you have to guide them through that meeting? Castro was there. George Bush, senior George Bush was there. It was an incredible event that he organized. And it's on that basis, this 50 years from that first vision in Stockholm in 1972, 50 years later, that's why we're doing the Sustainable Development Goals. You can trace it from event to event inside the United Nations. And for 50 years, Maurice Strong was the architect of this. It's just, for me, it's a huge honor that he was my friend, and we spent so much time together. And he loved tourism. He felt that tourism was a sector of the economy that could actually help make a difference in producing a decent environment and a better future. And he'd been part owner of a hotel in Geneva. I mean, he just believed that this industry had something special because of the way that it communicates with so many people. Because when people go to visit a place, the residents are part of the tourism ecosystem. So he understood that inherently. And we became friends when I was running WTCC in the 1990s. And we stayed friends for 25 years. It was just, it shaped my life, and it shaped my view on how tourism must evolve if we want to be like every other sector on the planet, and not be special and always asking for special consideration. When it comes to the climate, everybody has to get on the same page.
Yeah, and I see Maurice Strong died when he was 86 years old on November 27th. And he served as a commissioner of the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1986, and was recognized by the International Union for Conservation of Nature as a leader in the international environmental movement. So he really...
When he had his 80th birthday, that organization, IUCN, organized in Geneva something called the 80th, and they invited 80 of Maurice's close friends to an event in Gland, just outside Geneva. And I was there. And it was just, Cousteau was there, and Sylvia Earle, who did all the work on the oceans, Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, almost everybody who was anybody, Joan Goodall was there. So, it's an incredible contribution that he's made. And, of all the things I mentioned, he was also special advisor to James Wolfenson at the World Bank. I mean, whilst he was doing this, 7 times under Secretary of the UN, he was also working with the World Bank to make sure that finance was available for his vision of a green and clean world that we live in.
And he was a professor an honorary professor at the Beijing University, and an honorary chairman of the Environmental Foundation there. So he
loved China. We spent a lot of time together in China. I was heavily involved in the 1990s when China was opening up its tourism. And then with some of the leaders from the WTCC, we went in for a week at a time, and we sat with our sleeves rolled up with the senior people in the Chinese National Tourism Administration, the chairman, Mr. Liu, the vice chairman, Wen Chengbang. And we critiqued the 15-year plan that China had to develop its tourism, which in 1995, when we did this, there was no tourism in China. You couldn't move as a citizen. You had to get a permission to move from one community to another community.
Right.
But they had this 15-year vision, which they took through all their processes brilliantly. I mean, I'm a big fan of China too. And Maurice was very close to, he operated at a different level. He was close to the, to the leader of China. He was often talking to people on the state council in China. He had an apartment in Beijing. He lived in Beijing for the last few years of his life. And I met him there. We used to have dinner often, just the two of us in a little restaurant in Beijing, and just as you and I do, just have these nice conversations. And these are valuable things in life when you get to, when you get into that same age range as Maurice was, as I now am, you look back and you say, wow, these are the things that mattered.
Yeah, and this weekend is a big weekend for you. I think I read here at the worldenvironmentalday.global website under Only One Earth, Build Your Earth Action Number. So what's going on this weekend?
Well, all over the world. I mean, the best thing that's happened in the last 10 years, and I will speak about this, is the activation on the environment, and particularly the activation from the young people. And this is my hope for the future. This is what we're doing at SunX. We're training graduate students to operate as leaders in their country of bringing in climate-friendly travel. And that's very simply travel which is linked to the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris 1.5. And everybody's going to do it differently. There's no global model. There's no unique national model that other people need to follow. Everybody has their own circumstance, their own history, geography, culture, capacity for developing. So they're all going to be developing these plans for 2030 and 2050. And that puts us inside the world community. So often over the years, tourism and aviation, they've always pleaded we're a special case. We're not part of the global system, unless, of course, something bad happens and then we need the same support or more that everybody asks for. But we've always said we're a special case. But in the case of the environment, what's happening now is there's this grassroots movement started by Greta Thunberg and now in cities, every city in the world. And what I'm hoping for in the next 5 years is that we can somehow become a part of that through the strong climate champions that we're training in Malta.
Right. And World Environmental Day is officially in Sweden, I believe.
Yes, because the Stockholm conference was in Sweden. And thank you. It's very helpful for me to give travel lessons on your show. Stockholm is in Sweden, guys.
Well, some people don't know that, So.
Yeah, that's right. Would that be Stockholm, Wisconsin?
So looking at the world now and looking at the world back when you had your dinners with Maurice Strong, do you think the world has made a lot of progress when it comes to environmental issues in tourism?
Yes and no. And that's the answer that Maurice Strong also gave, not about tourism, but generally. He was asked that question in an interview that I saw the other day, and his answer was very similar to that. Yes, of course, we've made great strides. We have seen in tourism a lot of work by UNWTO, linking tourism with doing studies, a lot of studies to show tourism's linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. We've had a lot of individual countries. I was in Slovenia last week at the European Travel Commission's annual general meeting. And, this is a country which says we are a green country. All our tourism is green. And there's many, it's not the only country, it's just a very good example. I'm sure you saw it when you were in the Philippines with WTTC. When it started, there was no sustainable development people inside travel and tourism companies. And now you can see it. Booking.com is out there professing to be the leader in travel and tourism and sustainability. So there's been that whole shift of having some specialist people arguing 30, 40 years ago, hey, if we're going to grow, we need to be concerned about our impacts. There are a few of them, people who are ahead of the game. Now, I would say 80% of companies have some sort of sustainability component. Some of it is a marketing thing, but some of it is operational, and that's the key. The key is to make sure that this is part of the board culture and the operational culture of the company, and not just, you know, sort of stuck up on advertising. Yeah, there's been a major shift. Last year we had, of course, the Glasgow Declaration, which pushed the linkage between tourism and climate change. We signed that as a launch signatory, but at that time, I publicly said it's a good start, but it doesn't go far enough, fast enough. And that's what Maurice Strong would have said. You know, when you say that we have to fix things by 2050 so that we end up globally no more than 1.5 degrees, that means that people actually have to do things now to reduce the emissions. And some of that's happening, and some of it is in my view, questionable. You know, the airlines who are so important have an emission reduction program which relies on somebody else doing something somewhere to compensate for the pollution that the airlines are producing. And, you know, that's been described like the guy who says, I'm going to give up smoking, and he pays somebody in Central America to stop smoking and keep smoking himself. You know, it's the offset game is a sort of dodgy game. And I think what we now know is these numbers, which are coming from the IPCC, an independent group of scientists, these numbers have, because if they're not met, what we're seeing is the worst thing possible for tourism, which is extreme weather events. For 50 years, tourism has been built on the whole marketing and the whole tourism flow, with some exceptions like the Hajj and those kind of things, which is a huge flow. But for the most part, it's chased weather. You know, the European tourists, the Germans, the Brits, they were chasing the sun in Spain and Portugal. And it's the same thing in the US, Thomas. That's why people are coming to Hawaii and going to Florida. But if suddenly those temperatures, it's not so much that they suddenly reverse. You're not going to find that Hawaii suddenly has an Arctic temperature. It's the volatility that you're going to get a storm surge, and the storm surge is going to be so significant, it's going to take out the whole beachfront in one of the big Hawaiian cities. And that's the danger. And you can't have tourism in that situation. We can see that infectious diseases are being aggravated by the extremes of climate change. And look what's happened with COVID. Look what that did to tourism. Climate refugees. When you have droughts in Africa, a lot of people move north, and that's when you get these boats in Europe which are going to Mediterranean countries. What does that do for tourism? It's a very serious issue if we can't stop climate change. The environmental stuff is all important. The nature stuff is important. The animal conservation is really important. But the climate one is existential. If we don't all the other stuff, I've said this to you before, you're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and the iceberg is sort of in front of you.
And when you look at tourism, a lot of destinations, or a lot of people now after the pandemic are eager to travel. You talked about Hawaii. I can see our hotels are full, our flights are full. It's crowded everywhere again. There's not enough staff to really handle everything. And then our tourism board is talking about the Hawaiian culture, community, and brand marketing to combine with our values, what also is protecting climate change. So how should the tourism industry or destinations react to help with the situation of climate change and still able to function in the tourism industry?
Well, they're going to have to function based on reacting to climate change, because everybody else in Hawaii and you know, the visitor economy, the people who are building the visitor economy, they're residents, and they will be affected not because they're part of the tourism community, but because they're part of the Hawaiian community. And the Hawaiian community, or the Belgian community where I am, or the Chad community in Africa, anywhere in the world, has been measuring the impact of climate change and its greenhouse gas emissions. And they file all this stuff with the United Nations organization dealing with climate change. So the rest of the world is doing that. Now, tourism is mainly outside this system, but because of aviation and cruises are not part of that system. So when countries file their annual reports on their reaction to the amount of emissions they're producing, and every country has agreed to do this inside the UN system, when they do that, they don't include tourism. So it's really important that the tourism community comes on board with this. And one of the things that I'm doing in another, with another hat on, I'm involved as an envoy for, you know, the Sustainable Tourism Global Council in Saudi Arabia that my old friend Gloria Guevara, the last president of WTTC, is kind of helping to drive. And we're creating an entity which is the equivalent of the IPCC for tourism, because tourism's outside that system. So we're creating something called the TPCC, the Tourism Panel on Climate Change. And our plan is that we will have equivalent science-based figures for tourism as everybody else on the planet is doing. Tourism is, and aviation and shipping, they're the only people who are outside this system. So we hope to, and the beauty of what the IPCC has been doing is, Maurice Strong sort of created that in 1988 before the Rio Earth Summit, because he said, if we can't have agreement on the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, we're going to spend the whole 3 weeks of a summit arguing about the impacts. And some people will say X and some people will say half X. So he got a group of scientists through the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environment Program and said, you do the work independent of the political positioning. Never mind what India thinks, never mind what US thinks. You just look at the science. And we haven't had that. We did that in UNWTO when I was there in 2005 for the Davos conference that we held on climate change. WTO was pretty good on spotting this stuff. Francesco Frangeli, the then Secretary General, was really visionary on this. And we had a conference and we said there's no figures. So we commissioned a group of scientists to produce figures. And at the conference that we held in Davos, we had the numbers. We didn't have to discuss whether they're right or wrong. And that's what we're trying to do with the Sustainable Tourism Global Council in Saudi Arabia, is to produce a set of independent figures so that every time the IPCC produces its assessments, you've seen them, they put a lot of public relations, you know, they have a systematic approach in the climate community in the UN. Every year there's a COP summit. Every year they make out as if it's the only ever summit, and they have a big theme and conferences. And you know, last year in Glasgow, the Brits are really good at this promotional stuff. So that, you know, you have a big hullabaloo, and then you go away and you have another one the next year and another one the next year. And the IPCC produces this independent science analysis of how you're doing in relation to greenhouse gas emission, and in relation, this is going to be even more important to tourism in the short term, how are you responding to the impacts of climate change? The forest fires, the sudden cold spells, the floods. Look at the floods in Germany last year, you know, I mean, this was unprecedented. That affects tourism. So we're going to be looking at that and trying to give a sort of neutral, objective analysis, so people won't have to argue about how big or how serious the effect is. The figures will be there.
How would tourism boards, like regional tourism boards, for example, even national tourism boards, get all this information, and what assistance is there for them to implement all these necessary steps?
Well, it's complicated because on the one hand, you have the tourism silo, if you like, and you talk your own language, the language that we use, about load factors and in airlines and revenue passenger kilometers. I mean, that's alien to climate people. But the same thing in the climate world, they have their own language. So what we think is necessary is a translation of the bigger picture global activity into tourism terms and vice versa. That's what the TPCC will do. But there are other stuff. UNWTO has lots of stuff it's putting out on this. IATA has a group called the Air Transport Action Group, which is kind of supposedly independent, but which is very linked to IATA, which is bringing out its own information. And that's being made available to tourist boards. Now the big tourism players, Booking.com, I mentioned, they're deeply, and they have a hell of a lot of data on tourism travel movements. They're also doing surveys of traveler perceptions of, what was my holiday green enough? They'll ask that kind of question. So, and now with the information base, the metaverse, you can Google half the stuff you want.
But is it Googled? Is it Googled? I mean, if you look at the leaders of the tourism industry in many regions, in many countries, it doesn't look like they really have, I mean, they're using some of the verbiage, but they really don't have a clue. And there are others, they have too much of a clue, and the destination becomes almost not accessible anymore. I
mean, look, you were in the Philippines recently. Look at what they did with Boracay. Mm-hmm. If you remember, they closed it. They closed it for 6 months, and it was dreadful. I was there beforehand, and it was, you have beaches like that. They're garbage, and now it's brilliant. It's pristine. It's cleaned up, and the tourist board is at the center of this. These things. They're not usually driven by the tourism board, and certainly I suspect. This wasn't necessarily welcome because this was just a decision from the top that said we're going to close it whether you like it or not.
And Boracay is a very, very good example. I remember I was in Boracay in the early 80s, and there was nothing. There was just beautiful white sandy beaches and just a few, I call them huts, maybe like bed and breakfast type places, no hotels, no traffic. You take a catamaran with the chicken and everyone else on it over to the island.
Yes.
And I spent like 5 days there, and it was wonderful, really, if you want to get away. And then I came back maybe 5 years or so ago, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I mean, you would not know that this is the same island. And
I think it's becoming generally recognized, if not publicly said, that the downside of tourism growth can be very damaging to the environment. And I think, when we started talking about this in WTTC in 1990, at the time of the Earth Summit, very few people took it seriously. Now I think tourist boards, I was last week at the European Travel Commission, ETC, which is a very serious and good organization of 35 tourist boards in Europe, and I went to their AGM and to talk about this issue. They had 2 basically external presentations. One was the one that I gave on what we're doing at SunX Malta, and we've started now with ETC training sessions. We're going to launch in mid-July training sessions on climate-friendly travel with the European Travel Commission, free of charge. We try to do all our stuff free of charge, Thomas, because thanks to the the brilliant government of Malta. We have a 5-year agreement with them that they provide funds, so we don't have to spend our time looking for funding everywhere, which most NGOs do. And so we're putting on a free 1-week induction session on climate-friendly travel. And most of those tourism boards, of course, that's Europe, they're quite sophisticated tourism boards. They have their own programs in this field already, and quite intensive programs. Now, in places like Africa, it's not quite as developed like the tourism itself, but they're conscious of it, and they have a different take on it. You know, they're more likely to be worried about the impact on wildlife or the poverty impact.
Right.
Or take the Seychelles. I'm on a Facebook exchange with the guy who runs nature, I think it's called Nature Tourism in the Seychelles, Nirmal Shah, who's a very brilliant climate scientist. And he says, if we don't have tourism, our economy goes bottom up. You know, he's a climate guy, and he's actually advocating the growth of tourism and the absolute need to have aviation continuing and not be the subject of things like Greta Thunberg's no-fly movement. So it's evolved. 20 years ago, a few specialists talk about it. Now, everybody talks about it. The real issue on climate is, are we doing enough? Are we going far enough? And are we going fast enough? And I think, unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Yeah, and these things move slow. You don't really realize it. You know, I can tell you also from my own experience here in Hawaii, when I moved here in 1988, I remember the nice white sandy beaches again in front of the Sheraton Hotel in Waikiki.
Yeah, I was there in those days too. I stayed in the Ilikai, I remember.
Ilikai, yes, and the Sheraton a little bit further. And now when you go to Sheraton, there is no beach. There's simply no beach. And actually there is a walkway, a cement walkway, and they probably have to move that too, because it always gets flooded. So you have to actually walk inside the hotel to go back out to continue your walk on the beach. It's all gone. And after 30 years, there are not many people who remember this, but it's a slow process, and it's the same.
Yeah, and it's a process. It's a process which doesn't reverse. And from a viewpoint of the sort of planetary science, the cause of the climate crisis is global warming, because we have this kind of blanket around the earth, which is coming from the carbon pollution and the greenhouse gas pollution, not just carbon pollution. You know, carbon's 75% of the problem, but things like methane and sulfur oxide and nitric oxide are also part of this blanket which is built up. And it takes 100 years to get rid of it. So when you lose your beach in Hawaii because you've had, you know, serious storm surges and the beach eroding, it's not going to come back. Even if you fix the increase in the blanket around the earth, getting rid of that stuff is taking a hell of a long time. You know, and our, you know, if there's one point I should make in talking about this with you, it's not going to be you or me that's going to truly suffer or truly benefit from the change. This is all about 15, 20, 30 years in the future. We have to stop this in 2050. We can't go above 1.5 degrees higher than the old standards. When it was a constant level for 4,000 years, and then since the mid-1800s, with the industrialization of society, it's all peaked. Now, what the scientists are telling us is, you've peaked enough, and if you go more than 1.5 degrees higher, you know, we're screwed. The life on the planet becomes uninhabitable at a certain level. And at this moment, we're heading for 3 degrees. And 3 degrees, the heat waves and the flash floods and the downpours of cyclones and wiping out whole islands as we have in the Caribbean, that's going to be more and more. So it doesn't go back, it just gets worse. So we've got to do our part in tourism as well.
Yeah. Now, maybe a last point to make. How do you combine protecting the environment with corporate greed? How could this work together?
I think a good thing is to shoot the people who are greedy corporate people. That would be a really good solution. No, being serious, I think you have to stop corporate greed. I don't think you can, there's no half measures on this. You know, I'm an Elizabeth Warren fan. If people only need so much to live, and probably a lot less than those of us in the Western world are consuming. And if there's some people who are taking too much out, other people aren't getting enough. So I think it's not tourism that's going to change that. It's our society. You know, a vote for the right ethical, decent, you know, I'm not a big ethical or moral preacher, but I think there's a certain decency level that you live in, beyond which, you know, Elon Musk is not going to spend all his money. Jeff Bezos is not going to spend all his money. So I think you need to have a very, very high increasing rate of taxation, and you have to stop the corporations who are dodging it and paying the high-paid lawyers and accountants to say, oh, look, here's a loophole in the tax system. So if you move your corporate headquarters, you know, to country X, you're not going to pay any taxes. So corporate greed, you know, we have to deal with as a society, not as tourism.
Peter, Geoffrey, this was a fascinating conversation, and I hope we can do a lot more. And I think all our listeners who stayed now, and we planned this for 20 minutes, it's 48 minutes now. So I know I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much, Geoffrey, and good luck with your events this weekend.
Well, thank you. And you know, we're not just good friends. I'm a big fan of what you're doing with the World Tourism Network, with the African Tourism Board. You're someone whose contribution has not been recognized enough because you do it like this. You know, I call you up on Thursday and say, what's the chance of doing something on Friday? And you say, what time do you need it? You know, you're an inspiration in that sense, Thomas. And you know, at this stage of life, friendships are incredibly important. And our friendship has been going for a long time, and I hope for a long time going forward.
No, absolutely, Geoffrey. And we've gone through a lot in this world, you know, and we just have to move forward. And tourism is such a wonderful business to be in. And we have to keep it alive, and we have to be responsible in keeping it alive. Otherwise, we won't. But in any case, we
have to adapt. Tourism has to adapt like everybody else. And it's our kids, it's the next generation that understand this, that are marching for it, that are creating networks, and they're the people who can make the change. They're tomorrow's leaders.
Yeah, and for everyone who's watching us now and you missed the first part and you want to watch us again, we're going to repeat this every 2 hours. Just stay tuned, or easier, just go to breakingnewsshow.com and you can watch us anytime. Or of course, you can always go to our YouTube channel and click on any of the links on any of our websites. You get to our YouTube channels, and you can also watch us anytime. Same for our Vimeo channel. Geoffrey, thank you so much, and hope I talk to you again very soon. And stay healthy and enjoy your weekend, and all the best and success for this.
Yeah, and you stay healthy too, because I know you got a pretty bad sickness when you were at the WTTC meeting, and I'm glad to see that you're looking well and slimmer than you were when you flew out to the Philippines.
And the slimmer is important. Thank you very much, Geoffrey. You take care.
Take care. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.